Hello, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So this video is about why Israel should not annex part of the West Bank. So Benjamin Netanyahu is the Prime Minister of Israel and has been Prime Minister of Israel on and off since about 1994. Anyway, he has just announced in the midst of this general election campaign that he intends to declare that a bit of the West Bank of the Jordan Valley is going to be annexed by Israel, that Israel will regard it as Israel's sovereign territory. And it's a move that's been denounced by many people in Israeli politics, including the leader of the opposition of the White and Blue Alliance, saying that that Netanyahu was just doing this really to annex votes. He doesn't care about the land. Well, it will obviously be illegal and immoral to do this. It's wrong to simply take land from another country and say that it's yours. I know it's happened countless times in history, but I hope it will be beyond that, to behave in a more civilized manner, to be less aggressive. We have international law now, which is much clearer than it used to be, and it's dubious that it was ever acceptable. It's certainly not acceptable now. It would be illegal, it would be immoral, and it would be highly provocative. So it makes a mockery of Netanyahu previously calling for moral clarity in these matters. So the West Bank, as I say, is the west of the River Jordan. To the east of the River Jordan is the country which is known as Jordan. What else? Hello, Aubrey. Where am I reporting from? I'm in Barcelona. Anyway, the West Bank, well, that was the homeland of the Palestinians. There have been Palestinians in what we know as Palestine for centuries, for millennia. Often they didn't really identify as Palestinians. But we don't want to tell the whole story of Zionism. That's the Balfour Declaration, 1917. A significant number of Jewish people from Europe began to immigrate to Palestine. Fast forward, 1948, Israel declared independence, recognized by the United Nations, and the Palestinians, the Arabs who inhabit that area, then meant to be given a third of the land, despite being two-thirds of the population, to have the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. But various wars between them, obviously Arab countries generally backing up their fellow Arabs, the Palestinians, Muslims around the world usually supporting their co-religionists, and Palestinians being Muslim. About 95% of them are Muslim, a few are Christian. But anyway, the Six-Day War, 1967, Israel then occupied the Gaza Strip, which is on the Mediterranean coast, and the West Bank. And previously, Egypt had helped administer Gaza. Palestinians didn't have an army of their own as such, and the Jordanians had helped to administer the West Bank because it was a fledgling state, desperately striving to set up a state, difficult at the best of times, especially in the midst of a war against a much more powerful enemy. So Israel's occupied it ever since then. Many Palestinians have chosen to leave, been obviously severely discriminated against in their own homeland. And what else? So then Israel moved in a lot of settlers, illegal immigrants, let's call them what they are, into the West Bank without the permission of the Palestinians, and simply grabbed land, sometimes at gunpoint, saying you've got to go. Now, in fairness, Jewish people living in Arab countries such as Morocco, Libya, Iraq, I could go on, were often driven out by physical attacks, by persecution, by discrimination. It was a dangerous situation for them because since Zionism really got going, some Arabs and Muslims in other countries said, no, this is outrageous, and these Jews in our midst, some of them are Zionists, they want to set up the state of Israel, that's unfair. If you're going to do it to our co-religionists and our Arab brothers in Palestine, we're going to do it back to you, which is obviously unfair. Nobody should be discriminated against. I don't want anyone to be mistreated on the grounds of religion or ethnicity. Not Jewish people, not Arab people, not Muslims, not Buddhists, not anyone. So I'm saying what's happened. I'm certainly not saying that it was right that it happened. I don't defend this sort of discriminatory conduct. Anyway, so Jewish people living there, mostly Israeli citizens, a few not, and living there, and Palestinians mostly moving out, and Israel grabbing often the best land, the most fertile land for itself, hilltops, any strategic locations, create facts on the ground, said Ariel Sharon, the general, later Prime Minister of the Likud party. Now, the United Nations demanded that Israel withdraw from the West Bank after the 1967 war, which obviously Israel has consistently failed to do. Now, Israel bases its legitimacy to a large extent on the United Nations recognizing it, say, we're the only country created by the United Nations, therefore the most legitimate country on earth. Britain should rethink over its illegal occupation of Northern Ireland. Do you think, dear George? No, I shouldn't, because your premise is completely specious. It's not an illegal occupation. It seems like you're historically illiterate. Northern Ireland's obviously rightfully part of the United Kingdom. There was the Act of Union, the Irish Parliament, we voted to merge with the United Kingdom, and on. And obviously most people in Northern Ireland wanted to stay within the UK, even though the major portion of Ireland left. Have you heard of the Treaty of 1921, when Sinn Féin, that's the Irish ultra-nationalist party, agreed that Northern Ireland would be part of the UK? A high majority of people in Northern Ireland wanted that. There was an election on this issue. In the south of Ireland, 75% of people agreed to partition. Again and again, Irish nationalists and the Irish government have agreed to partition, but quite often people have reneged on this, and I come from the south of Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement, 1998, a referendum throughout Ireland, north and south, 85% of people voted for the Good Friday Agreement. 85% voted to accept that Northern Ireland is part of the UK. And those who voted against were mostly unionists, because it wasn't strongly unionist enough. So what you're saying is absolutely stupid. It's utterly ignorant, pig ignorant. So you've really made a fool of yourself. So it couldn't really be more legal and be more humane and more peaceful. And obviously the UK's record as having Northern Ireland as part of the UK is splendid, glorious, but not quite unblemished. So coming back to the issue at hand, Israel. So Israel has not withdrawn and has continued to move in illegal immigrants. Now, you're not a terrible person to be an illegal immigrant. If I was in a difficult situation, I might do so too. But Israel's wealthier than Palestine. You're moving from a wealthier place to a poorer place, dispossessing the much set upon Palestinians and setting up these illegal settlements on stolen land. And people often prove that they lived there in 1967 or subsequently, were driven out. Often they've got title deeds to it, and their ancestors lived there for a long time and say, oh, well, my ancestors are buried in this land, which they've now taken. And I feel sorry for Jewish people who are driven out of countries where Ishmaelites are the majorities, and that they ought to be given the right of return and restitution and so on. There should be compensation for anyone who's been forcibly deprived of his or her right of residence, or indeed property, both movables and realty. You've got to ask yourself, supposing you're a Zionist, how would you feel it was on the other foot? Supposing Palestinians had conquered what's now Israel and driven people out. You wouldn't think that's acceptable, so therefore it can't be acceptable the other way around. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Okay, we've got to be a bit fair-minded about this. I realise I've been foolish having the sun behind me, so I'm going to have to move my position. There we go. Sorry, not great at the aesthetics of this. It's not a professional studio, Ian. You may have deduced. Okay, so the Israeli illegal immigrants, that's what they are, settlers as they're sometimes called, have greater rights than the Palestinians. They are allowed to go on certain roads. In the United States, you wouldn't accept white-only roads. You wouldn't accept whatever black-only roads. This sort of apartheid, keeping people separate, it's outrageous. That's in the occupied territories. I'm not talking about in Israel proper. The same situation used to pertain in Gaza, but the Israelis withdrew from there completely some time ago, or indeed in Sinai, if you go back to about 1979. Okay, it's been occupied for 52 years. Some people have been born there, it might have been their grandparents moved there, so the Israeli illegal immigrants, I think there ought to be some sort of absolution and say, well, Palestine properly gets to control this land again. Say to the Palestinians would say, well, we'll give you permanent residency, or you can become citizens or something like that. But Israel runs it as though it's part of Israel. These people don't live in Israel, they have the right to vote there, whereas if you're an Israeli citizen abroad, you must come back and vote in person. I don't think they do postal voting or voting in embassies. And take the most fertile land in a not terribly fertile area, so it makes a big difference. Water's often in short supply. You need a lot for agriculture, and obviously these illegal settlements getting the lion's share of the water, lawns and golf courses, whereas the Palestinian-owned land is parched. So the Palestinians, they owned obviously 100% of Palestine. If you go back over a century ago, it was part of the Ottoman Empire. There are very few Jewish immigrants, but they didn't have a sort of separate polity. They've been allowed in. They'd had aliyah, or however you pronounce it, aliyah, immigration by Jewish people through the 19th century, but it hadn't been an influx, been small numbers. But the Palestinians have lost more and more of their land. We're meant to get about 33% of the land in 1948, and they now control a tiny fraction of that. They've lost almost everything. And now the Zionists want to take away the very name of the Palestinians, not admit that it is Palestine, call it Judea and Samaria. But how on earth does Israel get away with this all the time? I suppose it's because of the fulsome backing of the United States. There's the United Nations Security Council. There are 5 permanent members. The United States, the United Kingdom, the Russian Federation, the People's Republic of China, and the French Republic. And you need 1 of those 5 permanent members to block a UN Security Council resolution. So I know there are General Assembly resolutions, but they're passed under a different chapter of the UN Charter. The General Assembly resolutions are recommendations whereas Security Council resolutions are binding and mandatory. So the United States has used its veto in favor of Israel over 40 times. The US has used its veto on behalf of Israel more than it's used it for anybody else. I think more than they've even used it for themselves. So that's that. So whilst they have the unstinting backing of Uncle Sam, they know that they can get away with anything. And it wasn't always thus. The US wasn't so supportive of Israel back in 1956, the Suez conflict, the Sinai conflict. But then from Nixon on, they became very supportive, and now it's really sine qua non of American politics. You see how Ilhan Omar has almost been hounded out of politics for telling the plain truth that the Israel lobby has overweening influence in Washington, D.C. Now, there are obviously some Israeli Americans. There are more Jewish Americans. Most are Zionists, a few are not. And obviously these people have the right to express their views. I don't dispute that. Likewise, people should be allowed to express the opposing view, and indeed that is lawful in the United States. But you see how the Zionist lobby, it very often puts the interest of Israel above that of the United States. Israel doesn't do, well, the United States doesn't do that much trade with Israel, which has only got about 9 million people. Israel has never fought in a war alongside the United States. Whereas you look at other countries, like the United Kingdom has continuously fought alongside the United States since the First World War before. Not every conflict, but most of them. You go far back as the Opium War. Not that it was a moral cause, but the US and the UK were allies in that one. And so really Israel just gets everything it wants these days. Billions of dollars of military aid, intelligence sharing, despite Israel spying on the United States continuously, despite stealing their secrets, stealing some of their nuclear secrets. You know, there was Jonathan Pollard famously who spied on them. And obviously the Israelis denied, lied through their teeth that Pollard was spying for them. Finally acknowledged they've been telling all these lies all these years. Western powers did a historical blunder by creating Israel-Pakistan two-nation theory everywhere has failed. Well, about Israel, I'm minded to agree with you. I think the Balfour Declaration should not have been issued. So Arthur James Balfour did that, partly he thought he'd get more Jewish support in the First World War. But it did say, without prejudice to the rights of existing communities in Palestine, that the Arab majority should not be discriminated, it should not lose out. And what was this Jewish homeland? It wasn't clear it was a sovereign state. Was it to be a colony of the British Empire, a dominion of the British Empire, or what? Maybe it was to be a province within an Arab state, within Jordan or something like that. That was that. But you might say it wasn't the United Kingdom's to give away. People would have said that. Back then they might have said right of conquest. International law was not as developed as it is now. How are states created? Largely by conquest. How was the Republic of India created? You go back to the dawn of history when there was no Indian polity and some magnate, began to conquer land. It wasn't all done consensually, but now that these sovereign states exist, then we accept them. We don't try and unscramble the omelette. That would be impossible to change every border. About Pakistan, I'm inclined to concur that the creation of Pakistan was even more cataclysmic for Pakistan than it was for India. Okay, there's a lot that's laudable about India. I hold it in the highest regard in terms of having fair trial, freedom of expression. I know Narendra Modi has undermined freedom of speech somewhat, but obviously there's the right to vote for all men and women, and they're free and fair elections, and there's so much which is praiseworthy, and obviously the economy is roaring ahead. So I have the uttermost respect and admiration for Indian civilization, which is so ancient, from which people in the British Isles have learnt so very much. And Pakistan, well, the Pakistanis are like. It's difficult to find things to appreciate about the country, the landscape, the cuisine, not much more. Architecture, perhaps, but it's got none of the good stuff India has, really. It's got all of the problems, only far worse. So I pity my Pakistani chums. And I remember just once I met a Pakistani who had the moral courage and the sagacity to say that partition should not have happened and is disastrous, and he wished we could rejoin India. And there's no question which is a happier, freer country. So Pakistan, well, Islam is really not enough to unite it. There's so much internal fighting, not just between Sunni and Shia, but between people who support the Taliban, those who are against them, Baluchis who want independence, and on and on. And there's so much crime and so much heroin dealing, and women have no rights. There's so many honor killings. So it's just dreadful. Not wishing to be disparaging, that's the plain truth. And they'd be much better off if they're part of India. But there's no question that the Muslim League wanted it, that so many Muslims, particularly in those zones, wanted it. Not all the Muslims of the subcontinent, but in the northwest frontier, or Sindh, or the Punjab, or Bengal, yeah, most of them wanted it. But Congress agreed to it. Right? Indian National Congress, led by Nehru, they agreed to it. They voted for. If they voted against, I'm not sure what happened, might not have happened. Perhaps the United Kingdom ought to have granted independence to a united India, and then Indians could have sorted it out amongst themselves. I suppose the Muslim League would have led a massive insurgency, a bit like that day of action which occurred in Kolkata in 1946, when the Muslim League thugs, when they murdered hundreds of people. Now, the Indian army might have eventually, well, it would have eventually defeated them. There might have been some sort of Pakistan created as a compromise, perhaps smaller than it is now. But there we are. Two-nation theory failed. Well, I don't quite agree. I mean, Bangladesh is not rejoined. Burma was at one point considered part of India. There are obviously many separatist movements battling in India at any one time. We don't hear much about them, like in the northeastern states around Assam, or they're Naxalites. I know they're not ethnic separatists, or they were Tamil separatists, and on and on. So separatism goes on all the time. I mean, the two-nation theory with regard to the British Isles. Is Ireland a separate nation apart from the United Kingdom? Irish nationalists would say yes. You probably agree with it there. How about Israel and Palestine? Are they separate nations or not? Now, there's this one-state solution. The Palestinians and Israelis, they merge to form a single state. I don't know what you'd call it, and have equality there. But the thing is, the Jews are only 75% of the population of Israel, and they're falling. And then if they were to unite with the Palestinians, Jews would be like a third of the population or something like that. So what the Israeli government is doing is rubbing Palestine's nose in humiliation, stealing their land and proclaiming it to be lawfully part of Israel, something that even the Israeli government hadn't had the chutzpah to do. And by the way, I don't want to be too harsh on Israel. There are laudable things about Israel in terms of human rights or gay rights or gender equality or freedom of expression. And it doesn't torture as much as many other Arab countries. And yes, there are other governments, like the Syrian government, which has committed more large-scale massacres and so on. So it's by no means the worst in the Middle East. So Arabs have largely stopped backing the Palestinians, have given up on their cause. They see it as a forlorn hope. Palestine is poverty-stricken, not through any fault of their own. They're reliant on Israel for gas, for water, or for electricity. Look at Gaza. Only one of the entry points is controlled by the Egyptians, the other controlled by the Israelis. The airspace above Gaza controlled by Israel. The sea beside Gaza controlled by Israel. So what they get in and out, Israel controls, and Israel keeps them just above the grave, not quite starving them. So the Israelis can shut down and wreck their economy at any time. And so many Palestinians find the conditions of life there so intolerable that they move abroad in search of work in other Arab countries or further afield, becoming American citizens. I met a Palestinian in London just the other day, married to one of my British friends. So unfortunately, Palestine is largely friendless in the world, and the Arab League is doing very little for them. They're preoccupied with other problems, the Libyan civil war, with battling against ISIS in North Africa or Syria, the Iran situation, internal reform in Saudi Arabia, civil war in Yemen, what's going on, the row between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. There were internal ructions in Bahrain, and the Sunni dynasty, their minority, seems to have stamped down on the Shia majority. So now the Netanyahu administration has got this huge advantage that Trump is in the White House, and Trump is an inveterate Zionist. Obviously, he's pig ignorant, and he'll just agree with the next person, who's the last person who spoke to him, and you can play him like a fiddle. It's just so easy to manipulate him psychologically. A man of such raging vanity, you can easily caress his ego, and you just praise him to the moon, and then he'll think you're lovely and give you what you want. And this is a way for votes, that he'll be more anti-Arab and more anti-Muslim than anyone else. He's obviously an absolute bigot. So that's why he shifted the US embassy to Jerusalem. Now, various US presidents had talked about doing it, but he'd actually fulfilled that campaign pledge. So for once, he was a man of his word, when he's reneged on so many other promises. So Netanyahu is wily, and he knows how to soft soap Donald Trump and gets what he wants out of him. Remember, Benjamin Netanyahu, he opposed peace in 1994, that Madrid peace plan. And then Sharon was, not Ariel Sharon, the other chap, Rabin was assassinated. Netanyahu was in the deeply embarrassing situation of having to try and implement a peace plan that he'd strongly opposed, but he was able to sabotage it anyway and get back to conflict, which is what he likes. So he's obviously very much into oppressing the Palestinians. How can you argue the Palestinians aren't oppressed when their land has been stolen, they're illegally occupied, decisions are taken in the Israeli Knesset, the legislature, and the Palestinians have no input to that? I know there are Arab Israelis, okay, Israeli citizens of the Arab ethnicity. I'm talking about the Palestinians, the people who live in Gaza or the West Bank. I know people like Ben Shapiro, by sleight of hand, will say, oh, Israel doesn't discriminate against Arabs. Look at the Arab parties in the Knesset. And of course, it's laudable that they have their rights, although somewhat's been taken away because Israel's now an ethno-state for the Jewish people, so like making the Arab Israelis second-class citizens. I know the situation in many Arab countries is much worse, but talking about the people of Gaza and Palestine, they're under illegal occupation for Israel's security. Would it be acceptable to illegally occupy Israel for Palestine's security? Who's really in danger? It's the Palestinians who've had thousands of their civilians killed by the Israelis, not the other way around. Israel's got nuclear weapons. Israel's armed to the teeth. Israel's got the unlimited backing of the world's only hyperpower. Palestine is none of this. It's Palestine is imperiled, not Israel. Palestine's in grave jeopardy, could be wiped out any time. Talk about Israel being wiped off by the map by Iran. Palestine's almost been wiped off by the map by Israel anyway, having grabbed most of its land. So thousands of Palestinian civilians have been slaughtered by the Israeli defense forces over the decades. And it's true that sometimes the Israelis take pains to reduce civilian casualties. But take that 2009 invasion of Gaza, when at least 2,000 Palestinian civilians were killed. And it's true that Israeli civilians have been killed as well, and Palestinian militants have occasionally deliberately targeted Israeli civilians. Now, purposefully killing civilians is never acceptable. So what do I mean by purposefully? Knowing someone to be a civilian and killing that person despite knowing it, okay? It's not the same as there's a house over there, they're enemy fighters, we bombard that house, we kill the enemy fighters, there was a civilian in there too, and we killed her as well, but that wasn't actually our aim. Now, because if your rules of engagement are that strict, then you'd always lose because you'd almost never be willing to fire because the enemy wouldn't be far enough away from civilians. We're going to bomb a target with some enemy fighters in it, we bomb it, successfully destroy it, but there was a building some distance away which was also damaged and some civilians in there got killed too. That is not deliberately killing civilians, but so often civilians have been purposefully targeted. Why is it purposive? I suppose sheer racism, partly to try and frighten the other side, to stampede them out of wherever it is they're living. So the movers and the shirkers of many governments, they did the most to avoid proper condemnation of Israel, and Israel really stretched the bounds of impunity then. So yes, it's reprehensible when Palestinian fighters deliberately kill Israeli civilians. Are they terrorists? Well, that's debatable. What is a terrorist? I suppose it's someone who's fighting illegally, particularly by unethical means, someone who's outside the Geneva Convention. And it's true that the Palestinian militants, they sometimes don't wear uniforms. You could say they're outside the Geneva Convention. They do have a chain of command. Now, the Israelis often fight outside uniform as well. Shin Bet often do it. Mossad often do it, going to kill people when they're not in uniform. And they obviously don't abide by international law. They don't always abide by the Geneva Convention. Sometimes torturing people. I got to hand it to Tel Aviv. They're at least honest enough to tell the plain truth about it. I mean, most governments in the Middle East torture. Israel is unique in at least being honest about it. So they deserve certain credit for that. Moderate physical pressures, they call it. But obviously people are held without trial by the Israelis, including children. So the Palestinians, it's crazy that one gets highly criticized in the US if we say anything negative, however true, about Israel. Ilan Omar represents my state. Indeed, because, Zionist influence in the media is overweening. I'm not saying they control everything. No, that's not true. I mean, the Zionists, they don't have a corporate view about gun control, the environment, abortion, taxation, any other issue. Really only about Israel. That's it. And the thing is that they've now captured both parties. And this is not anti-Semitic. Most Zionists are not Jewish by ethnicity or by faith. Most Zionists are Christian. Okay, they're mostly white Christians in America. Could be some African Americans too, and so on. So there are plenty of Jewish people who are non-Zionist or even anti-Zionist. Palestine even had a Ministry of Jewish Affairs staffed by Jewish people. Iran has got a Jewish representation, the Majlis. There's a Jewish community in Bahrain. Indeed, the Bahraini ambassador to the United States, she was Jewish, and on and on. There are even a few Jews in Syria. So, and really, okay, Jewish people lived in Palestine or Israel in ancient times. They also lived in Iraq, for goodness sake. Scotland's highest civil, Alan Gibbon, I couldn't read the rest of that. So, anyway, that's that, because obviously there's some very powerful Zionist corporations, very wealthy people, and they donate. And there's the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, and they donate to politicians of both parties, and they will attempt to terminate your career if you say anything disobliging about Israel, however true it may be. And why is it the US gives so much money to Israel? What does the US get in return? Very little. This sort of liberality is the kind of thing that Republicans really wouldn't like, giving something and getting almost nothing in return. So now the Saudis and the Israelis are kissing, making up. Saudi Arabia, the most Islamic extremist country on earth, which is viciously oppressive of non-Muslims or Shia Muslims. You have to be a Sunni Muslim. Women have only just got the right to drive, where there are no fair trials, with these barbaric punishments, floggings, amputations, public decapitations, grossly unfair trials, torture is used on quite a wide scale, and many bonded laborers from South Asia live in semi-slavery there. But anyway, it really gives lie to Israel's claim to gain-stand Islamic extremism, that they're now best buddies of the Saudi Arabians. Admittedly, they haven't actually extended diplomatic recognition to each other. But it's because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Okay? Scotland's High Civil Court has ruled the suspension of Parliament unlawful. Alan Gibbon, I didn't know that. Breaking news for me. I don't know what's going to happen. Go to the United Kingdom Supreme Court, I suppose. So, next step. Okay, so Iran is a 90% Shia country. Saudi Arabia is about 90% Sunni, and they discriminate against the Shia minority, sometimes pretend that Shia don't exist. Obviously, Saudi Arabia is Arabic-speaking. Iran is Farsi-speaking, or Persian-speaking, you can call it. And they're the two major powers in the Middle East, so there's a lot of bad blood between them historically. Israel fears Iran, claim the Iranians are trying to develop nuclear weapons. They've been saying this for a quarter of a century. The boy who cried wolf. Why should we believe them now? So they may well team up with the Saudi Arabians to attack Iran, at least get permission to overfly Saudi Arabian airspace to bomb Iran, something like that, gearing up for a proper war. I think nobody's talking about a real ground war, an invasion and occupation of Iran, because that would obviously be such a bloodbath, and they're not willing to suffer that much. So Bahrain, Egypt, and so on the Saudi Arabian side. Bahrain has had Saudi Arabian troops to help the regime crush protests by the Shia majority there. Qatar is too friendly with Iran, despite Qatar having a Sunni majority. UAE is kind of neutral, a little bit inclined towards the Saudi Arabians. Oman really is neutral. Yemen, there's a civil war between the Sunni and Shia, and the Houthi rebels. Shia's backed by Iran, and Saudis backing the other side. It's a proxy war. The Saudis are bombing the Houthi insurgents there. And on and on, to some extent, the same thing is happening in Syria, where the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the Iranian army, are also there. They're four square behind President Assad's secular regime, despite Iran being a confessional state. Now, it's true that Assad is a Shia of the Alawi sub-denomination, a very secular one at that. Okay, there's no religious law enforced there. That's one of the few things I can say in his favor. The Saudi Arabians backing the rebels, the Al-Nusra Front, which is a subsection of Al-Qaeda, or indeed ISIS, the Islamic State in Al-Shams and Iraq. So, you know, Saudi Arabian government armed and funded these rebels, terrorists, to be fair, in the case of ISIS, who've committed countless large-scale atrocities, and release people from prison on condition that they go and fight on the side of ISIS and so on. There's this obviously civil war in Libya. It's not quite sure which countries are bombing the government or bombing the rebels. So Turkey is also against ISIS, battling in Syria, but also has grabbed a bit of Syrian territory. The Syrian government is far too feeble to reclaim that. There's a Turkoman ethnic minority in Syria. So it's very complicated. Israel's got decent relations with Russia, and at least 10% of Israelis are of recent Russian ancestry, often Russian-speaking. Some people born in Russia become Israeli citizens. So it's immensely complex and vexatious relationship between the two. Israel is the deadly enemy of the Syrian government, and Iran, but Russia has cordial relations with both the Syrian regime and Iran. They've deconflicted zones in Syria for the Israelis to hit Iranian targets. So the Russians aren't that good to their Iranian confreres. But the Israelis want to avoid hitting Russian targets. They don't want to provoke them. And Russia, of course, was a major backer of the Palestinian cause when Russia was part of the Soviet Union. So Netanyahu's aggression is scandalous, and he's not been called out on it properly. And it proves that he doesn't really want peace. But the Palestinians, I mean, they can't fight. They're obviously heavily outgunned, and the Israelis really hold all the cards, and they inflict so many more casualties on the Palestinians. Think of the civilian death toll in 2009, 100 to 1. I'll say it again, 100 to 1. 100 Palestinian civilians killed for every Israeli civilian killed. Now, I don't want anyone to be killed, particularly not civilians, but it shows how grossly disproportionate the Israeli reaction was. So there we are. This shouldn't go ahead. It's probably going to go ahead. Israel's going to get away with it yet again because Uncle Sam will back them up. Oh my God. And if you dare raise your voice in favor of Palestinian rights, saying they shouldn't be dispossessed, they shouldn't suffer this way, it's grossly unjust, you'll be now denounced as a terrorist sympathizer, an anti-Semite, or what about the Holocaust? Yes, the Holocaust was horrific, which doesn't mean it's right to kill Palestinian civilians, which doesn't mean it's right to steal land from Palestinians. How would that be right? It wouldn't be right to do it to Germans or anyone. So I want justice and equality for all. I don't want anyone to be mistreated, but so often it happens, and so often people abuse the Holocaust to then try to excuse these gross injustices inflicted upon the long-suffering Palestinians. Palestine has often been ill-served by an inept, corrupt, self-serving and asinine leadership. But that doesn't mean that they ought to suffer mistreatment at the hands of the Israelis. And of course, the Trump administration is going to just give them a green light to do it. And he knows this will play well with anti-Muslim bigots in the United States. He knows it will go down well with anti-Arab racists there and militarists, Christian fundamentalists. Oh, the Bible give us this land and so on. Lots of bits of the Bible he overlooks. The bit about love your enemy, he's not so keen on that bit. All right, that's enough from me. Now I need donations to keep this going. Please donate liberally to me on Patreon, and follow me on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. Please get your friends to subscribe. I teach people lessons online in English as a foreign language or English history, in what I was going to say, English literature, French up to a basic level, politics, things like that. Prepare people for IELTS. I help people prepare for law degrees, for job interviews. I'm a tour guide in London. So contact me. There's a way to message me through this channel. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.